I was very concerned when Daniel locked me into that little room just now. And I was concerned because I thought I didn't have any pills. And I always have a pill at 7 o'clock. And the pill is a pregabalin, and it stops pain, basically. And I thought, I pulled out my pregabalin, and it was empty. And I thought, what am I going to do? I have no pregabalin. My legs are going to twitch more and more. You're going to think I'm going to walk next or something. And then I found one, so I was okay. So the fact that I was locked in a small room with only Michael Faraday for company was not a problem because I had my pills. So many scientists have been, let's say, different. Can we just say different? Different from the average, although they might not ever have been formally diagnosed with an impairment. So I'm thinking of the greatest scientists that the United Kingdom has ever produced. Without doubt, they would, I think, be Sir Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. I don't think there were better scientists or more significant scientists than those. And both of them had impairment. Isaac Newton was a very unusual man indeed. He stuck a bodkin into his eye just to see if it hurt. I could have told him that. Charles Darwin wanted to be a doctor, and then I don't know what his issue was. Maybe it was some sort of chronic fatigue syndrome or mental health issue, but he never made it to that station, and thank God he didn't, because he left us such an important legacy. But not just them. Henry Cavendish lived, a spit from here. Henry Cavendish, a very unusual man indeed, but discovered most of science, didn't tell anybody about it. But he was the richest man in England at the time. It didn't really matter. Paul Dirac. The stories of the physicist Paul Dirac are legion. They could take the rest of the evening. Stephen Hawking, who I had the honor of meeting. The president of the Royal Society, still alive, still wonderful, Lord Rees, Martin Rees, also has acute scoliosis. I went to talk at CERN. It was a great privilege. I descended into the tunnel at CERN. You can see I'm a bit of a groupie, and saw the whole Large Hadron Collider laid out before me. It was very exciting. And I went to talk to them about disability and neurodiversity, and they said, we've got a bit of that here. Because, of course, 6,000 or 7,000 people employed at CERN, physicists, engineers. I'm not going to say any more. You can imagine. I had an excellent neighbor who worked at CERN. He was a lovely man, not particularly sociable. So clearly, when I talk to any audience about disability, I talk about how reliant they are on the internet and on computing, how they found out about tonight's talk through the internet, and that most of the internet was written by neurodivergent people. It was created by neurodivergent people. So disabled people across the centuries have been scientists, engineers, mathematicians, technicians, everything. And why not? Why is it a surprise? Disabled people are in every walk of life. And it's a particular thrill for me to talk at the Royal Institution because, as I said, I'm a science groupie. I'm really proud. One of the best things I ever did in my life was to partner with Duncan Dallas, who is in Leeds and who created the first Café Scientifique. It's in French because people in England would only talk about ideas if they thought there might be French involved. The Leeds Café Scientifique in Chapel Allerton, the Newcastle Café Scientifique, which I founded in January 2000 and still meets to this day. It's very exciting. All across Britain, all across America, and in many parts of the world, there are science cafes or cafés scientifiques, call them what you like, where people literally like this come together, have some drink, get mellow, and listen to somebody spouting off. Normally in a cafe site, only for about half an hour, you've got a full hour. Bongs, if the bongs don't go, we're going to have to wait in silence until they go. Because I think science is about the best thing that the human race has come up with. The scientific method, the empirical approach, skepticism, Let me prove that. Experimentation. I mean, Newton putting a bodkin in his eye, we can laugh about it now, but he wanted to experiment, and nothing would stop him. So I admire the scientists who've stepped into this place and have taught to you and have worked here. Daniel was telling me about the Nobel Prizes, the scientific papers, the elements, literally the elements that have been discovered on this premises. So it's very exciting. So, of course, disabled people have been scientists because disabled people are everywhere. And we make up something like 15% of the population, according to the WHO. So that means every single family has a disabled member. There's about 1 billion people worldwide. And I'm talking about all disability. So I've already mentioned autism, ADHD, MS, dementia, sight or hearing loss, the whole works. Not being able to walk very well, everything. So don't restrain yourself. It's all good. And disabled people have been part of life, part of human life, part of the natural world. I remember talking to the Provost of Kings, Sir Patrick Bateson, who is the president of the Royal Society, I think, and about disability in the natural world. What happens when animals are disabled? What happens to them? Are they involved? And I think there's a whole literature about that now, which is very exciting. And over a lifetime, you, ladies and gentlemen, will move in and out of the disability category, partly because I hope you're going to get old. I hope you're going to get very old. And as you get older, I'm sorry, you're probably going to become disabled. So something like, only 1% of births, and I remember telling some geneticists that it was only 1% of births are affected by disability. And they said, is that all? I said, yeah. And it's like 1 in 8 of us, so you're never going to be able to get rid of us that way. So 1% of births, 5% of children, because of course lots of developmental disability and things that become obvious as that people get older. Something like 10 to 20% of adults, and well over 50% of people, no, that's not true. I can give you the statistic, is 49% of adults over 60. So it is something that increases through life. It also increases with poverty, increases with war, increases with a lot of social factors. Driving badly, smoking, drinking, eating badly, having poverty so that you can't eat well, so that you can't eat greens. And what we've done, and this is, people lecturing in this very space have probably done it, we have reduced mortality. So you will live longer. That is fantastic. That's great news. The arguably less good news is that although mortality has decreased, morbidity has increased. Morbidity is not being very well, i.e. being disabled. So we live longer, but a longer proportion of our life is spent with forms of disability. It's always been here. It's a fact of life. It's part of life. Get used to it. End of lecture. It's easy. The bong, we're going to have to wait a long time for the bong. I just came from Cork Street. I was in Flowers Gallery, and I happen to know, because I know the artist, that although that woman who I saw the work of is disabled, she's got cerebral palsy, she would say, I think if she's here, that dyslexia, which she also has affected her life far more. And when she puts words on the canvas, those words are freighted with meaning and significance for her as a person with dyslexia. But in fact, she's not alone. Loads of people in art schools have dyslexia. It's very common. And so impairment is a fact of life, but disability is a social and cultural category. Think about when dyslexia, the word, was thought about. People who don't believe dyslexia exists. Think about you if you grew up learning English. Think about 3 letters and how we spell things. Think about the letters 4 letters, O, U, G, and H, and then think of the same word spelt the same way, though, through, tough, sort, and lots of other variations which look the same but sound very different. And what's quite interesting about dyslexia is that in Italian, in Italian, you speak all the letters. The pronunciation is the same. There aren't any strange words. So if you have dyslexia and you're in Italy, you're more likely to learn that you're dyslexic when you come to England or when you learn English. So when I say that although impairment is a fact of life, disability is a social and cultural artifact, that's the sort of thing that I'm meaning. It depends on where you are, what you want to do. I mean, if I'm not going to do it because that would be taking experimentation too far, but let's say I chopped off the end of my little finger. I don't think there'd be any loss to anybody apart from the squeal that you would hear down the street. Yeah, I suppose I do type. It wouldn't be very good. But it wouldn't fundamentally be a problem for me. But if I was a concert cellist or a pianist, it would end my career. Unless, I suppose, you could have you do have one-handed concertos and so forth. But that was after the First World War when lots of people lost their arms. So it's cultural. It's about what you do or what you want to do. It's not a natural kind. So I'm a sociologist. I study people. I'm not a real scientist. I'm a social scientist. But they've let me in, and I'm not going to tell them. And I think people are more complicated than rocks or plants. I do think that. Although I've tried to read Jim Al-Khalili's book about quantum biology, and I just can't understand it. So perhaps I'm wrong. But sociology has three basic methods. And Mike Oliver told me this, so I'm sure it's true. You can count people, you can watch people, and you can talk to people. And being fairly sociable, I prefer the third method. I listen, hopefully. I don't talk very much. And in all my career, I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of disabled people, mainly in Britain, but also in Africa and Asia and so forth. I've talked to people about genetics. I've talked to people about sexuality. I've talked to children with disabilities. I've talked to people with mental health conditions. I've talked to people about COVID. I've talked to people with dementia. And the point that you learn when you talk to people, if you talk to them properly, if you spend some time with them, is that, you know what, the disabled people have a quality of life that's the same as yours. So I'm guessing that most people in this room are non-disabled, and I'm guessing, I hope, that you're happy with your life. Well, so are disabled people. And that might be a shock. It is a shock, because we have this idea that disability is about suffering, it's about difficulty, it's about misery, and people can't be happy. There's actually a very famous paper by Gary Albrecht and Patrick de Vliet called The Disability Paradox, which explains just this. How is it that disabled people say their quality of life is so good? Because they do. That it's as good as or better than, and that really pisses them off, better than non-disabled people. And that's the truth. I'm not making it up. Maybe they're lying. There was a school of thought that disabled people must be lying, or they must merely have got used to being crap, and therefore they were okay. No, there was a paper by a guy called Ron Amundsen, which is all about what he calls hedonic adaptation. And he says, no, they're not lying. The psychologists have looked at this, and disabled people are telling the truth. They really are pretty much as happy as everybody else. Not everybody, of course, but then, frankly, non-disabled people aren't all happy either. The one thing that can decrease the quality of life is pain. And I told you about my pill and the fact that I really wanted to find it before I was unlocked from that room. The Sparkle study, which is a study of children with cerebral palsy across Europe, found that the quality of life of children with cerebral palsy was just as good or better than non-disabled children. So in itself, that is great. The one thing that made a big difference was pain. If they had pain, that made them more miserable. And I'm very happy to be short. I don't really care about being in a wheelchair, but pain is a problem, which is why I'm so glad that I found my pill. So I'm not surprised that disabled people have a good quality of life. My father was short, and there's a lady in this room who's saved from pneumonia by my father, so I'm glad to have met her. I always meet somebody. My dad was happy. I'm happy. I met one of my children here tonight, so at least one of them's happy. I think both of them are happy. I think there's only two. I'm not the Prime Minister of England. I met my grandchild at the weekend, and she is very, very happy indeed, I'm glad to tell you. And I've met hundreds, if not thousands, of disabled people through my life, and the vast majority of them seem to have high levels of well-being. Okay, I think you accept that. I hope I've persuaded you of that. So I want to offer you a second, and I think more complicated paradox. So you've accepted that. I hope that you'll look at the evidence if you want to, and you'll find out that I'm telling the truth. But if disability is so good, if having a health condition is so, doesn't stop you being, well, why don't you all have one? Seriously, why don't you all have one? And you're not flocking in the street going, you know what? Tom was right. I'm going to go and chop off a bit. You are looking, I hope, both ways when you cross the road. You are probably watching your figure, you're eating properly, you're not drinking, all those boring things that make life that are very important for your well-being and happiness because you don't want to be disabled. And I think that's an intuition that we have. That, so somebody dies, it's very sad, but at least they had a full life and they didn't have a long amount of suffering and restriction. We don't want to have an impairment on average. But this is a paradox, because you've accepted what I said earlier, that disabled people generally have a good quality of life. Yeah, it is true, so please accept it. But I've also said that you want to avoid disability. I'll just have a sip and leave that paradox with you. It is a paradox, isn't it? Because if we weren't bothered, we wouldn't want to avoid disability. We're not bothered if our children are male or female or something else. We're not bothered as long as they're happy. But I think we do look with some concern as to whether the child is healthy. That, I mustn't grumble. It could be worse, whatever it might be. So we want to eliminate polio. I worked at the WHO for 5 years, and outside WHO is a statue, because WHO, I think, got the Nobel Prize because it had eliminated smallpox. And there's a little gap next to it for when they helped to eliminate polio, but it's still unfilled. Because there's 2 countries where there is endemic polio in the world, and last week I checked, there were polio cases in Benin, DR Congo, Malawi, Mozambique, and Afghanistan and Pakistan. So it would be wonderful. I don't think anybody would disagree, I think, that it would be wonderful if we could eliminate polio. Wherever I go in the world, I meet people who have good lives, but wish they hadn't had polio as children. We wish that we could cure dementia and so forth. And I'm not talking about prenatal conditions. We can talk about that later or some other time. I'm talking about conditions which make your life more difficult because if you get them, you're going to be more restricted. So I'm talking about preventing people become disabled. And yet that is a paradox. I really think it's uncertain. And I think that even people, and even if disabled people here don't agree with me, all right, my challenge to you is become more disabled. Are you okay with that? And I'm not sure you are. I'm moving my arms around. I'm paralyzed low down. I don't want to be paralyzed any higher up. I'm glad I'm paraplegic, not quadriplegic. And similarly, I think somebody who's got a little bit of sight, I would guess, is glad that they don't have no sight. And somebody who has a little bit of hearing is glad that they don't have no hearing, and so forth and so on. Most people with disabilities don't want more disabilities. They're not neutral about that. So I think that we need to think about why it is and how we can resolve that paradox. So let me give you an example from the 2009 British Social Attitudes Survey. It's published in 2012. So the traditional view of disability is that it's all about health problems. And indeed, 36% of non-disabled people believe that health problems are what prevent disabled people living a full life. That's actually very good. It's only 36%. That's the dominant view, I think, but it's not the majority view. So most of us think that the real problem for a lot of disabled people is attitudes and barriers and discrimination and oppression. Only 17% of non-disabled people think that's the major problem. The largest proportion think with me that it's about, and it's 47%, believe that it's a combination of health problems together with attitudes and barriers in society which prevent people leading a full life. So I think it is a mixture. That is my position. As I say, you can go home. What about disabled people? Now, lots of disability activists would disagree with me. They would say that it's all about attitudes and barriers, because that's a social model of disability. And it's that's what you can change. That's what social change is about, changing attitudes, removing barriers. And that's very important. And a lot of people who are from a more radical wing wouldn't necessarily accept what I've said so far. They wouldn't accept that impairments and illnesses are bad. And I remember going to an international conference, and there's a disability activist woman there from Uganda, and she said, "Why are we trying so hard to stop polio? Because polio just means you're in a wheelchair like me. What's wrong with that?" And that view is not totally uncommon. It's rare, but it's not uncommon. Mike Oliver, I remember mentioning him earlier, said that aeroplanes, and think about this later, aeroplanes are a mobility aid for people who can't fly in exactly the same way as wheelchairs are a mobility aid for people who can't walk. So is that true or not? I think it's great. I think it's very provocative. It's very interesting. Yes and no, I would say. And what's really interesting is if you go out and talk to the wider disability community, you just take a sample of disabled people, only 15% of disabled people on average think that the main problem is attitudes and barriers. More than twice as many, 38% of people, agree with me that the issue is a combination of the health problem and the attitude and the barrier. So it's a bit of both. But the largest proportion of disabled people, 46%, believe that health problems alone are responsible for them not leading as full a life as non-disabled people. So that's really interesting. And I guess they really have talked to all disabled people, not just to disability activists. They've talked to the whole range, probably quite a lot of older people, and that's where they get that view. But it's not just that survey. So the 2007 Experiences and Expectations of Disabled People survey for the Office of Disability Issues, of those disabled people who said they were not able to lead a full life, 87% it was because of their disability, only 2% said it was due to attitudes and barriers in society, and 8% said it was due to both. So, we would like to think that actually impairments are not a problem, but that's not how people experience them. So that's why there was the paradox. That the lives of disabled people are good, but most of us agree that illness and impairment are best avoided. So let me say a little bit more about the radical disability position. So back in the 70s, there was the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. And they came up with what Mike Oliver would later call the social model of disability. And the social model relocates the problem of disability away from the deficits of body or mind to barriers and oppression in society. So people are disabled by society, not by their bodies. In an inclusive society, free of all barriers and oppression, people with illnesses and impairments would lead better lives and not consider not buy into that cultural myth that bodies or minds can be a problem. Now, that's not the only thought that is out there in the disability movement, so please forgive me if I have caricatured it. And around the world, what's been really wonderful about the disability movement is that it's been disabled people speaking for themselves. So you've probably come across the phrase, you might have used the phrase, nothing about us without us. And this is the idea that we need to speak, we need to be heard, we need to have control over our lives. And I would call this a minority group model of disability. So that we know who people with disabilities are, they're a group that needs civil rights and better treatment. And it came from America, where there's a whole tradition, as you know, of civil rights and minority groups. But I don't think it's just in America. I think it's also in the UK. And I think, in fact, our social model understanding, although it came about here, is also in the USA. And if you look at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UN treaty, it's got both elements in it, I think. It's a treaty which outlines in 50 articles how disabled people can be equal and included. And I commend it to you, and I think you should think about it. You should read it. But what's quite interesting is that neither the minority group approach or the social model have a lot of space for impairment or illness. They tend to be the more private things. They tend to be the things that people don't talk about. Or maybe, it was very interesting because most disabled people do talk about impairments and illnesses and the difficulties of them in private, but I don't think they necessarily do in public. And one of the reasons they don't is because as soon as you acknowledge any of this, then people say, you see, you're a poor, sick, sad, disabled person, and we just need to feel sorry for you. So that's one view. And disabled people have been trying to challenge that and say, no, we're equal, we want to be included. So if you start talking about impairments and illnesses, it sounds like you're going to the traditional view. But I want to open a space where we can talk about impairments and illnesses without people thinking, well, they're just poor, sad individuals, we don't have to do anything. I do think we need to change society. That's where I agree with disabled people's radicals and disability movement. But I don't think that ends the issue of disability. I don't think that ends the problem of disability. But there was a very important book, which I just want to spend a few minutes talking about, by a philosopher called Elizabeth Barnes. And this book was produced in 2016, and it's called The Minority Body. And if you are at all interested in philosophy or in disability, I do commend it to you. It's an excellent book. It's a really well-argued, written book. I think she's wrong, but I don't think you're going to get a better account of disability from the radical perspective than from Elizabeth Barnes. So she does two things in that book. First of all, she wants to redefine disability. And I've said that you have a sort of common sense view of what disability is, and she wants to think about it differently. So for her, disability is those forms of life for which the disability rights movement should be trying to secure justice. So not what they actually are doing, but what they should be doing. That is for her disability. But most importantly, she describes disability as, and I'm using capital letters, you can't see me, but I am, mere difference. So for her, it's not important. It's not part of your biography. It's not explicatory. So it's not that it's a negative form of embodiment. It's just another form of embodiment. So I want you to think now about whether you hold that, whether you could hold that. I make a distinction between biological impairments. I've talked about impairment as a fact of life, but disability as a social and cultural phenomenon. Disability for me is very social and cultural. She doesn't make that distinction. She uses one word, disability, to refer to everything. But what does she mean by it? So I want to highlight the two claims that she makes. First of all, and this is absolutely right, she's completely correct, she says disability is very diverse. You have, obviously, people who have sensory limitation of blindness or deafness. You've got people who have intellectual disability, learning disability, people who have mental health conditions, psychosocial disability. You've got people who have physical impairments and the range of illnesses and impairments. You've got people who've got chronic health problems that are invisible but actually limit them a lot. So that's already a whole range. And then you've got things that start before birth, starts childhood, as we've said, things that start in adulthood, things that are associated with aging. If you talk to a lot of older people, they wouldn't see themselves as disabled. They would just say, well, it's natural, it's inevitable, isn't it? You lose, powers and you forget things or whatever it is. But they would be classed as disabled. So what does Elizabeth Barnes mean by it? Well, she says it's so diverse, disability, that it's not, you can't, in her view, root it in a physical, a bodily or mental difference. It's not a bodily departure. And I should have probably, if I was a proper philosopher, told you that I think disability is I don't want to use the word deviation, difference from species-typical functioning. So I think that we are evolved to be a certain way, and where we don't achieve that, for whatever reason, then I would call that disability. We can go into the details of that because, of course, I would think of disability as broadly negative, and you would say, oh, well, hang on a minute, Tom, what about positive? Anyway, we'll talk about that later. So she doesn't want to think of that as a species-typical functioning. She doesn't want to think of disability as intrinsically pathological. She doesn't want to be normative about it. And she would certainly disagree with me, but she says, and I quote, disability is all and only the things that the disability rights movement ought to consider as things they're promoting justice for. So what she means is that it's not necessarily what you do, but it's what you ought to be doing. It's very ingenious, but it's also very unusual. I think when I first described it, I don't think you'd necessarily have agreed with her. It's a philosopher's definition. Philosophers are very keen on definitions. But what's quite interesting is that it allows Barnes and us to think about lots of different eras of history. You can think about different planets for that matter. Disability is things for which the disability rights movement should be fighting. So we don't have to say, oh, well, Claudius really had cerebral palsy. We can say he was laughed at a lot wherever he went. He was the emperor, you remember, who, you obviously, hopefully you don't remember. Even here, you don't remember. But the Emperor Claudius, and it's a great mystery as to what his disability was. But what she would say is it's the sort of thing that you should be fighting for equality about, that he was laughed at by members of his family and indeed the common people because of his dribbling and his excitement and his unusual way of getting about. And she would say, that's the sort of thing the disability rights movement should have, would have, if it had been there, which it wasn't, done something about. Now, I think that we have to be pretty clear-eyed about the disability rights movement because I think it does a lot of heavy lifting, you might say, in Elizabeth Barnes' argument. And I don't, we've already talked about how people don't necessarily know all about disability rights thinking, but I'm not even sure that the disability rights movement always speaks for all its members in the views that it holds. For example, obviously you've heard the statistics I gave you about lots of disabled people actually think that health conditions are very important. But there's another example, which is about assisted dying. And I don't think any disability rights organization has supported assisted dying. However, if you look at what disabled people think, they are like everybody else, broadly, not massively, but broadly supportive. Arguably, the disability rights movement, like a lot of movements, it has to be said, is out of touch with what the majority of people who share that experience have. I'm not sure she's right. she would say that, and I quote, "There's nothing about what disabled bodies are like that by itself unifies or explains the category of disability." And it's because disability is so diverse, so different. But I want to respond to her. And I want to say it doesn't really, that heterogeneity, that difference, that diversity, doesn't mean that the concept is not helpful. And so, for example, in the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who I'm sure you've heard of, the philosopher, he talked in Philosophical Investigations, he talks about a complicated network of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing, sometimes overall similarities. I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than, quote, family resemblances, unquote. For the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eye, gait, temperament, etc., all overlap and crisscross in the same way. So I think that disability is like that. I think it's like family resemblances, overlapping and crisscrossing. Not one thing, but actually we do know what we're getting at. And if it's about following rules, knowing what we're getting at, knowing the example of where we use that word, the philosopher and social scientist Peter Rinch talked about, I want to say that the test of whether a person's actions are the application of a rule is not whether he can formulate it, but whether it makes sense to distinguish between a right way of doing and a wrong way of doing things in connection with what he does. And I think within a culture, there's usually broad agreement about what disability is. We know the rules. Few people have difficulty distinguishing between, for example, having restricted growth, like I do, or just being a little bit small, a little bit short, petite. Disability is a helpful category, which doesn't mean there's complete agreement as to who counts as disabled. There's always boundary disputes, but there are with any concept. I don't think it matters. As Peter Rinch says, that you can be mistaken. I think you're allowed to be mistaken, but we do, I think, have agreement as to what that rule is. And I think if you've been attending carefully, you'll remember that I gave the example of older people. And older people don't think of themselves as disabled, by and large, even though they have got health conditions, because they just think they're naturally older. So immediately you remember me saying that, and I've just reminded you, damn. And you go, hang on a minute, Tom. They wouldn't agree with the application of the rule, would they? And I'm going to say, they're wrong. They're wrong because we have to make a distinction between objective and subjective. That subjectively, lots of people think strange things. Liz Truss thinks she's got the right idea. Sorry, political. People do think strange things or wrong things. But objectively, we can agree. We can say, no, this is, and I guess with Liz Truss, the test will be whether it works. She believes that will lead to that. Well, let's see. It's a pretty brutal way of finding out, but, we're going to see sooner or later because she doesn't look as if she's going to change her mind. So I think that when we're talking about objective, we're talking about surveys, we're talking about which can be challenged, and how to disaggregate disability. I was asked to be on a committee, I hate committees, of the Office of National Statistics. I don't know anything about statistics. I told them this about how to disaggregate disability, and there are many meetings are going to happen which will advise them on how to disaggregate disability, because it's not simple. But it's surveys, it's tools like that, which are the objective account of disability. Subjectively, we might disagree. Lots of people who I mentioned who have chronic illness, who have hidden disability, don't think of themselves as disabled people at all. Because, of course, disability is very pathologized. It's seen as being a really bad thing. So why would you want to say that you were part of that group? So if you can, you'll say that you're like everybody else. You're just normal, yeah? nothing wrong with me, whether or not it's true. But if Elizabeth Barnes has a way, people hopefully won't always think that, because she says not only is it hard to categorize it in any other way than saying this is what the disability movement should fight for, but she also talks about disability as a mere difference. Her book is called Disability, a Minority Body. So she thinks that to be disabled is to be in a minority group. And it's not that she says that all disabled people can do everything. And what she says is, most people can't do everything. And sure, people who are totally deaf can't hear music, but how many of you went to a classical concert recently, or any concert recently? It's not necessarily what everybody wants to do all their time. And similarly, of all of the limitations, yes, as she says, we need not deny that disabled people miss out on some intrinsically good abilities or experiences. It's just that they have access to other different good things. So she does say, you don't have to say that people will do everything. So she's doing a little bit more than a conventional social model view. So she'll say that sometimes impairment is bad. It's bad for individuals. But she says that disability overall, impairment overall, is a mere difference. It's not a bad thing, because there are lots of other good parts of impairment. And she understands that will challenge the conventional account. So most people, she says, thinks of a woman with disability that if she could keep her friends, her interests, and her community, but lose her disability, most people think she'd be better off. And I think that is probably many of our intuition. But she says that she wouldn't be better off because it's a mere difference. And that's not to say that you shouldn't try and make people's lives better, but it's to say that impairment is not bad, even if some aspects of it might be difficult. So, you might not be able to see your baby's face, but overall, it's good, is what she's saying. And she's not taking what she calls an X-Men view of disability, that disabled people have like compensatory abilities, read your mind or whatever it is, ignite fires or flood the place, or whatever it might be that X-Men does. But she does say that, and I think she's right, that having an impairment might liberate you from some of the stereotypes, gender stereotypes, beauty norms. She says it can be an important part of the way of understanding the world. But then when I read that, I think she's right. But I think actually there's nothing to stop anybody rejecting those norms. It may be that disabled people often have to reject those norms because they can't conform to them. But surely none of us are trapped within ideas of how people should be, men and women should be, gay people, straight people should be, or whatever. We can challenge those and act differently. She says, look, all right, it's the common sense view that disability is bad, but common sense has often been wrong, is what she says. And people like Hume and Kant, the great philosophers of the past, said some terribly racist and sexist things, at which she goes, you don't like that, but you do think they're pretty good. Well, I don't like what you think about disability, yeah? So she says that common sense it can be wrong as well. Even pain. So I've talked about pain as being the thing that a lot of disabled people think is a real problem. But of course, when you study pain, it's really complicated. Pain doesn't necessarily correlate with well-being. So it's not straightforwardly that you reduce pain, you increase well-being. It's complicated, and there are lots of books about it. So she is right to say it's complicated, but she's wrong in the sense that she implies it doesn't matter. It does matter, I think, really seriously for a lot of people. So I don't think she's got us off that hook. But Barnes thinks that we should listen to perspectives of people with disabilities. I agree with her. She says that, that for example, when disabled people say that impairment isn't a problem, they must be right. We must agree with them. And she says, look, we wouldn't disagree with gay people or women or other minorities. But I think there's a false analogy, because I think that, yes, there are parallels. There are lots of parallels about stigma and about attitudes and about cultural history and all the rest of it. There are lots of parallels about direct action and about the way you get the law changed and all the rest of it. But I don't think anybody, of course there are things about being a man and being a woman that are difficult, but I don't think people would say it was bad to be a woman full stop, or bad to be black, or bad to be gay. I don't think we'd think that anymore, although they would have done it a few hundred years ago. But I do think it's hard to say that there aren't some forms of impairment when we say, actually, we wish you hadn't had to have that. That is really difficult, like motor neuron disease or other conditions. There are lots of impairments which are bad. And unlike, that's different from the gay, the women, the ethnic or racial minorities. It's not a good analogy in that case. Because I think, and I spend far too much time on Twitter, so I know that people spend a lot of time talking about how difficult their lives are. I know what disabled people talk about. And I started this talk talking about neurodivergence. Well, I won't go into it, but I've got if you come back to me, I've got a whole list of people with autism saying what a problem autism is for them. So, even that, which is popularized in the notion of neurodiversity and all the rest of it, there is an argument. So for example, this gentleman saying that he gets overloaded from birdsong in the wrong moment. I get overloaded by the wind on my skin. I get overloaded by the scent of the smell of a flower. So he finds that very difficult to cope with. Now, that's not oppression. That's not something that you can remove. You can avoid it. Of course you can avoid it. You can not go out or not go in nature. But that is, it's difficult to explain that away. And there's lots of other examples we could give. So I think that most impairment, most difference involves a certain amount of discomfort or difficulty. Maybe not all, but much. And that's why we'd rather avoid it. And that's why we think that actually it's important to attend to it. That not attending to it, pretending somebody is just like everybody else, is itself a silencing, is itself a failure to do what's necessary. So let me give you a couple more examples of Barnes' approach. She highlights people by whom impairment is celebrated and to whom impairment means a lot. And of course, there are lots of people. Impairment is a really important part of life. But think about, everybody here would agree that poverty is a bad thing. But then you think about Woody Guthrie, who was a hobo for a period of his life. We think about British and American folk music, most of which was written and made by really poor people. We think about all of the cultural flowerings of disadvantaged people. So what are we saying about that? We're saying that's fine? Let's live in Appalachia and be really poor, because that way we'll produce better music and then we'll listen to it on Radio 3 and we'll feel good about it. But I'm sorry you guys have to be really poor, but we're really enjoying your music back here. Stop grumbling. No, we don't think that. We do value the tradition, of course we do. But we don't think that it is worthwhile. We don't make people poor so that they can, we don't lock them in tenements so they can come out with great literature or whatever it might be. So we disagree with poverty. We want to stop poverty, I hope. And so I remember a disabled person some years ago saying to me, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe disability is not like race and gender and so forth. Maybe it's like poverty. We don't want to keep poverty. And he would have said, we don't want to keep disability. So People can adapt. People can adapt to impairment. People can live with impairment. People can lead good lives if they encounter the right environment and have the right supports. Human beings are almost infinitely adaptable to all sorts of things: impairment, divorce, bereavement, poverty, cancer. And so I'm not going to say that impairment is such bad that we must eliminate it at all costs. It's part of life. I've already said, really, that we can't eliminate it, but it's not a mere difference. I don't think that poverty is a good thing. I don't think divorce is a good thing, although it may be a good thing for some people in some circumstances. So I don't think disability is a mere difference. And before I finish, let me give you, and I haven't sort of fleshed this out, so that's why it's you'll notice in the last few minutes. I want to talk to you about what if I disagree with Barnes, if I disagree with the radical social modelists, then it's up to me. You'll say, well, what do you think it is? What do you think disability is? And how do you resolve that problem that, on the one hand, lives of disabled people are good, and on the other hand, impairment to you is bad? And I do it like this, because I think that having impairment, being a disabled person, is about having limited choices. We can't do everything that other people can do. And that doesn't mean that life is bad, as long as we can depend on accessible transport, a proper place to live like everybody else, a job like everybody else, and all the other things that other people take for granted. So as long as we have access to the same social goods as other people, we can have an impairment and still have a very good life. And what we need to do is to ensure that more people, and that this isn't the case by any means, more people have access to the schools, the jobs, the housing, the accessible transport. I'm glad you're here. Stay awake. This is your bit. The importance of being able to go places, because Alan is a great campaigner for Londoners who use public transport and are differently or otherwise disabled. We need to be able to ensure that people have as much choice as they can, but there will be limited choices, inevitably. Like, for example, you might, some of you might be deeply into S&M. Don't tell me now. Don't even tell me afterwards. Just never tell me. But your choice is to have lots of terrible pain. That's fine. My choice is not. However, luckily I have my pill tonight. Generally speaking, I don't have a choice. I have pain or I don't have pain. It's not my choice. So what I'm saying is that for most of you, most of the time, pain is not your choice, and you're supporting that. I can't make that choice because my choices are restricted. I can't have control over everything. So and it was quite interesting. Well, it's not interesting. It's terrible. It's awful. In the Grenfell fire, do you know that disabled people were twice as likely to die as non-disabled people? And that's factually correct, because you can just do the numbers. And disabled people far more likely to die, because as soon as the lift is out of order, they can't get out. And that's why you shouldn't ever put disabled people on the top floor of tower blocks. And that was the crime. So you can avoid it. You can do something about it. But it means we have less choices. And where it's very difficult to get housing, I don't think that disabled people should ever be on top floors, because if things go tragically wrong, and there's all sorts of social reasons why they go wrong, but they do sometimes go wrong. For example, in any emergency disaster, disabled people are more likely to die. And some of that is because it's just stupid. People say, if we shout loud, everybody will hear. No, not if they're deaf, or if we put the news on the telly, everybody will see it. No, not if they're visually impaired. So some of that is just incompetence of public policy. Some of it is, unfortunately, like if we're all being chased by a bear, some of us would escape and some of us wouldn't. And I'm afraid Alan and I, we're not going to escape. So, just life's shit. So really, that's my conclusion. No, I'm not a perfectionist, because some people are perfectionists about this. They feel that medicine, that science, technology is going to get to a position where there won't be any suffering, there won't be any difficulty. And if you think this isn't true, I've spent a lot of time talking to people like that. And transhumanists and all the rest of it believe that through science, we'll be able to eliminate pain and suffering. Well, we won't. It'll always be here. We're always going to die. Remember, mortality decreases, morbidity increases. Hopefully, we will deal with some of that morbidity. And we've seen this week, first glimmers of some hope in terms of people with dementia and not turning it off, but slowing the progression of dementia. So I think it's very interesting. Difficulties will remain. I'm a pessimist, and I think that's an honourable position. I think life is shit. That's what pessimists think. But human beings make it great, so I'm an optimist as well. So to be human is to be embodied. We all have transient illness and impairments. If you've accumulated enough of them, you're disabled. Too many and you're dead, so let's not go there. It's a social and cultural process, what we define as disability. So we should do what we can to mitigate it. How can we mitigate? How can we decrease disability in the world? Well, we can prevent people getting ill in the first place by having good food and standard of living and housing and all the rest of it, good rehabilitation, good assistive devices like Alan's wheelchair and mine, to ensure that you can still get about, that it doesn't permanently affect functioning. We can offer counselling, support groups, so that a person doesn't get locked into this view of themselves as rubbish and second class, because they're not. We can change the environment. We can have level access trains and buses. We can have trams. We can have housing. We can have buildings that you can get in and out of. We can have all of those things, barrier-free, accessible, reasonable accommodation, which could make a real difference. We can change society, so there's more acceptance of different ways of functioning and different ways of being in the world. We can legislate for more inclusion and participation. I talked to you about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's been ratified by something like, I think, 185 countries. There are only 195 countries in the world, so that's almost all of them. The Americans never ratify anything. So we can change society, we can legislate, and we should offer all of these as far as we can. We should make it a less disabling world. I think that the way I started is very important. We should value the incredible achievements of disabled people everywhere. In the history of the Royal Institution, on Strictly Come Dancing, yes, we should have disabled people on that, and everywhere. But we don't need to, as part of that, accept that impairment doesn't matter. It does matter. It matters in your biography. It matters because we're not neutral about public health. It matters because it matters to people, and people matter. And so I think that if we don't attend to this difference, we won't be able properly to attend to people's lives, to the richness, to the fullness of people's lives. We won't be there for them when they need us. We won't listen to them. We won't hear them. And they themselves will have to shut off a part of themselves. They won't be able to talk about something which actually they live most every day and which they think about a lot. Not all, but many disabled people. So it's important for effective provision. It's important for effectively, I think, coming to terms with... It was very interesting. I'll just leave you a final anecdote. I wrote a book a long time ago about the sexual politics of disability with two other great people. And I spoke to a guy, and he'd had polio in his youth. So he hobbled about. He used a stick. And he said, and he said, all my life I've thought of myself as gay. He was a member of the campaign for homosexual equality in the 70s. He was a great campaigner. He said, I've never thought of myself as disabled. And so he had shut away that part of himself. He'd shut away that part of his identity. And I think that actually often a research interview is an opportunity to rethink that, to think, actually, who am I and what's important to me, what matters to me. And for him, I think that something that he'd always been told was shameful, he realized was just another part of life, and that he should not glory in it, but accept it and get on with it, because he always had, and people like him always do. Because we're human beings, and human beings are very good at dealing with whatever life throws at them, which is, I think, just as well. Thank you very much.